On the evening of the 19th of January 1917, I would not have wanted to be standing where I am right now. At 6:52 p.m, one of the worst industrial accidents London has ever seen took place right here. This place, which is now full of new apartment buildings, the DLR, directly above me, would have been like something out of a nightmare. This is the Silvertown Explosion. I've never been to this part of London before. Been to a lot of bits of London, somehow missed Silvertown. So my own experience of Silvertown is seeing it through the photos that I found during researching this video. And it certainly didn't look like this. Everything feels new. Everything here is a new apartment building, a new block of flats. It feels incredibly modern and incredibly residential. And actually that was one of the things that hasn't necessarily changed completely about Silvertown is, yes, there was a lot of industry here, but it was also incredibly residential, which unfortunately for this particular story meant there were a lot more people in danger.
The Silvertown and North Woolwich area is roughly 3 miles from east to west. And when the Victoria and Albert Docks were created in the 19th century, that essentially separated them from the rest of East London, the two districts basically became an island on the north bank of the River Thames. And by the time the 20th century rolled around, Silvertown was a hugely industrial part of London. And when you added it to Canning Town and West Ham, it became the largest manufacturing area in the whole of the south of England. And when you looked around at this mixture of industry and residential homes, you could be sure that most of the residents there were employed in the local factories. Now, why was Silvertown called Silvertown, you might ask? Well, it was named that because of a rubber factory that was established there in the 19th century, called S.W. Silver & Co. But it wasn't just rubber that was being made here. There were all kinds of different products being produced. And some of the other factories were making soap, flour, oil, dye, timber. Now, Brunner Mond & Co., the company at the heart of this disaster, opened a chemical factory here in 1893, producing soda crystals and caustic soda. But in 1912, the caustic soda side of the factory was discontinued. And so for 5 years, a few of the Brunner Mond buildings were laying dormant. And here's where the First World War comes roaring in like it often does to kickstart this whole tragic tale. As we've seen in previous videos, there was a huge need for high explosive shells. But at the beginning of the war, there weren't a lot of places to make them. And because of the rush, the whole idea of building a bunch of new munitions factories was just considered too difficult and it would take too long. And so when the disused part of the Brunner Mond works was discovered, it was considered the perfect place. Now, unsurprisingly, the company weren't too sure about this idea. Let's just say they didn't like the idea of making bombs when they were surrounded by many other companies producing things like oil, creosote, flour, and wood. And even if they were to discount all of those incredibly combustible materials being produced nearby, there were then the rows and rows of workers' houses, literally yards away from the chemical works. But war being war, and the need being so great, the Department of Munitions ultimately got their way, and the company consented to start production of TNT. The work started in September 1915, and they were purifying about 70 tons of TNT every week. And I'm not an explosives expert, but the process roughly involved crude TNT arriving, being unpacked by hand, and then loaded into a large melting pot. And once that purifying process in the melting pot had completed, flake TNT was collected in cotton bags and then sent off. And so for 2 years, Brunner Mond continued to purify TNT at their plant in Silvertown, right up until Friday the 19th of January 1917.
Just up here ahead of me, where I'm walking now, is one of the few signs of the industry that used to be everywhere around me. Behind me is this huge chimney and this old mill, and these are some of the only remaining signs of the industry that used to be here. In fact, there used to be huge chimneys like this all over this area, the different factories, and the Brunner Mond chemical factory. And now this old building is a haunting reminder of the industry that used to fill this entire area.
On this particular evening, 10 men and 10 women were working at the TNT factory, whilst at the time the building was surrounded by TNT waiting to be transported.
At around 6:45 p.m, a fire broke out in what used to be the buildings behind me.
It's not certain exactly where the fire was, but it seemed to be either in the room where the melting pot was situated, or if not, maybe in a room above or below it. And the first people to call the alarm were 2 workers who were seen running from the building, shouting, "Fire!" And from this moment, something of an exodus of the workers that were there began, with other people quickly following the first 2 who had run outside. Now obviously this was a very populated area, and even at this time in the evening there were many people gathered around. There were houses nearby, there were the other factories, there were many people around to see the commotion that was taking place at the Brunner Mond works. And a lot of these people stood in the street and just watched, none of them truly realizing the danger they faced. Now, a fire in an explosives factory, you might be thinking, yeah, this sounds like a recipe for disaster. But then you take into account the fact that there was a fire station, Silvertown Fire Station, was literally across the road from the entrance to the factory. Which again, is possibly a reason why some of these people were like, okay, we can watch because the fire brigade are right there, they will turn up and they will put out the fire and we can just watch and it will be quite exciting.
Behind me here, where this Oasis Academy is, was the Silvertown Fire Station. And when you think, there is where the Brunner Mond factory was, the fire station could not have been any closer, or you'd think any more well placed to deal or help out with this tragedy. But unfortunately, nobody realized that there was little they could do to stop what was about to happen.
There happened to be 7 firemen on duty at the station, and they were alerted to the fire and they rushed over to start tackling the blaze. But already by that point, this fire was getting out of control. This feels like the perfect point to hand over to one of those firemen who were there at the time. Namely, fireman James Joseph Betts. And this is his incredible account that he gave years later to the Sunday Express.
It was 10 minutes to 7, a chilly, starry night on January 19th, 1917. The war had dragged on for 2.5 years, and I was on night duty with a number of others of the brigade at Silvertown Fire Station. On every side loomed the black shapes of factories. Behind screened windows, for every precaution was taken in those days of air raids, and not a light showed. Vast armies of war workers were engaged on their various tasks of turning out munitions, food, and clothing for the troops. Opposite the fire station was the munitions factory of Messrs. Brunner Mond Limited. Pedestrians hurried past the fire station to and from their work, for it was about the hour when shifts were changed. Children carrying baskets of provisions and enamel tea cans containing the evening meals of parents working overtime hastened on their way. There was in the air the electrical tension brought about by high-speed production in an urgent cause. Suddenly, without warning, a bright orange tongue of flame shot up from the very heart of the Brunner Mond works, high into the air, all the more vivid on account of the enveloping blackness of the night. Into the station rushed one of the men. "Brunner Mond's is alight," he shouted. None knew better than we the terrible implications conveyed by that brief warning. For, once those rising flames reached the danger buildings, there was little hope for the lives and property in the vicinity. There was, too, a further danger, for besides the vast quantity of TNT contained in the danger building, there lay on the permanent way that ran close to the building 4 railway trucks containing enough of the deadly stuff to blow up half of London. Well, within a few seconds, fire alarms rang through the station, and our chief immediately rapped out orders. There was not a second to lose if we were to quell the fire and avert an explosion. But I felt it was such a forlorn hope that I yelled to my wife, who, with our 12-year-old son, lived in the quarters behind the station. "Get out of it, Polly, for God's sake. We're all going up in a minute." The next second we were tearing across the road into Brunner Mond's yard. Outside the fire station, people stood transfixed as though fascinated by that now fiercely burning building across the way. Others were fleeing helter-skelter anyhow, anywhere from that flaring presage of imminent danger, yelling warnings as they went. Some lay flat on their faces on the pavement, some prayed against the walls of the street. As we entered the factory gates, we were met by the flying figure of the timekeeper. "Run for it, mate, we'll be gone in a minute," he yelled to me as he almost staggered past, hatless, distraught, his face distorted by a terrible fear. They were his last words. Then, it was as though heaven and gravity plunged to meet the earth in a shattering upheaval. In 1 second, the whole world seemed to have crumbled.
There was a huge explosion. The factory was wiped out in an instant, and huge pieces of machinery, some of it weighing tons, was flung through the air, ultimately crushing anything that happened to be where it landed. Buildings nearby were reduced to dust, with the fire station opposite being completely destroyed, and the houses and factories around that weren't completely destroyed were left with gaping holes and incredible damage from the force of the explosion and from the debris that was flung everywhere. A 15-ton mass of molten iron landed in the road outside and turned out to be the remains of the factory's huge boiler. Those unfortunate enough to have been in the immediate vicinity of the factory disappeared in a flash, with no remains ever found. And slightly further away, bodies lay everywhere. Families were separated, mothers searched frantically for their children, and many, many people were buried in rubble, which lay everywhere.
Sorry to jump in. If you're enjoying the video so far, just a quick reminder to hit that like button and subscribe for more like this. It really helps the channel out. Back to the video.
It might have been seconds, minutes, hours before I next remembered. I was lying on my back, on a piece of waste ground 200 feet from the spot where I and other firemen had been fixing the hose ready to play on the flames. Around me was a vast plain of rubble, and the factory had gone. There were fearful sounds in the air, the screams of injured women and children, the groans of those imprisoned under debris, the rattle of rafters and girders being feverishly overturned by rescuers who had rushed to the shattered area, the shrill resonance of ambulance bells, the imperious clang of fire alarms, the roar of flames. On every side, great fires were blazing. There were these towering bonfires of light spread out across the black landscape, and as their flames leaped up to the sky, they threw into relief the broken shells of rows of houses, streets without windows, and, what was more, without inhabitants. Some were dead. No one knew yet how many. And the rest were gone. Anywhere away from that scene of death and destruction.
Some of the photographs we have from the aftermath of what happened demonstrate the absolute devastation that would have been right where I'm standing. Flattened homes, debris, rubble, material and machinery that got thrown by the force of the explosion out of the factory and smashed through buildings over here. It would have been chaos. And let's not forget the fact that in and amongst that debris and machinery would have been the remains of the victims.
While the great battle against the fires was being waged by firemen, a large arm of helpers was helping to extricate the dead and injured from the wreckage of their homes. The heaps of ruins which had been houses were slowly explored. It was like scraping and scratching among great rubbish heaps. Sometimes a distracted mother in search of a missing child would push herself to the forefront of a group of searchers and herself claw at the pile of rubble in a frenzy of apprehension until her fingers bled. Such scenes were frequent. One of the bodies dug out of the wreckage was that of a young clerk engaged in a large sugar refinery. One of the factories set ablaze. This youth had run from the factory to the manager's house close by to warn him of the fire. As he was knocking at the door, the explosion occurred, and the wall of the house collapsed and buried him. A number became mentally unhinged by the shock. One lad's blood turned to water, and he died 6 months later. My wife was rendered stone deaf. One encountered at every turn stories of simple heroism and human fortitude in the face of this terrible calamity. There were tales of rescues by those who themselves were seriously injured. One man dragged 4 badly injured young children from the wreckage of a demolished house, and it was not until afterwards, when he suddenly sank into unconsciousness, that those around realized that he had himself lost a foot.
And quite tragically, I found a list of different victims of this explosion, describing where they were found and who they were identified by. A city fruit salesman identified the body of his grandfather, who was 57. A labourer living near the scene of the explosion identified the body of his 8-year-old son. A working man found the body of his daughter, aged 21, outside his house, and later discovered that he had unfortunately lost his other daughter, who was 23. A labourer identified the bodies of his son and 2 daughters. The body of a plumber from Liverpool, aged 30, was identified by his landlady. A son-in-law described how he found the body of his father-in-law, an engineer's fitter, aged 53, lying in a butcher's shop. A hawker described how his brother-in-law, also a hawker, went out in the morning with a van and was found dead. A labourer said he discovered the body of his wife in the office where she was employed. These were all from the Stratford Express, given throughout January and February 1917. This list of victims and where they were found clearly demonstrates the cold-natured, widespread, and random impact of the effects of an explosion within an incredibly built-up industrial and residential area, and the heartbreaking reality of the chances of survival seemingly coming down to dumb luck.
This terrible story of death and destruction was told to the world in the following prosaic announcement which appeared in the daily newspapers. The Ministry of Munitions regret to announce that an explosion occurred this evening at a munitions factory in the neighbourhood of London. It is feared that the explosion was attended by considerable loss of life and damage to property.
James Joseph Betts was later awarded the King's Medal for Bravery.
Where I'm stood next to this huge chimney is at the top of Mill Road, which was the road literally opposite the old Brunner Mond chemical factory. And so standing here, you would have had a perfect view of the explosion that took place. Now, Mill Road was obviously pretty obliterated after the explosion took place, with this chimney really being the only evidence of what used to be here, because everything else is a building that almost certainly wasn't here in 1917. But there are a couple of roads where the old Victorian terraced housing still exists. Right, I am now walking down Boxley Street, which is just a little bit further down the road, where actually a lot of the original Victorian housing that was here at the time still exists. And you can actually see on one of the old maps all these houses lining this road. So these are all houses that would have witnessed this incredible explosion, and I'm sure didn't escape undamaged themselves, and clearly were patched back up in the repair works that happened in the aftermath. And it is nice to know that as different as this whole area is now, there are still these little pockets of what it used to be like.
In and around the rubble, houses that had escaped complete destruction were left standing like skeletons among the carnage, with windows and doors blown out and roofs completely caved in. New fires burned in the surrounding factories and mills, which continued to burn as the night went on. Within hours, fire engines from across London arrived on the scene to help try and fight these many raging fires across the whole area. And the force and the heat of these fires was so strong that weeks later, as they worked their way through the rubble, they were still finding red-hot embers. Within 15 minutes, members of the St John's Ambulance Brigade arrived on the scene, and St Barnabas Church, which was nearby, became something of a hospital station. Around 600 people who had received minor injuries were being treated on the street by private practitioners. The whole district was sealed off, not only so that rescuers could focus on trying to save whoever had survived this, but also to prevent looting. Some of the more severely injured were taken to Queen Mary's Hospital, and a makeshift mortuary was set up in a nearby school. This also being the middle of World War I, some soldiers were actually called in to help out as well. A lot of them having actually been called in from other parts of the empire, and there were many Indian soldiers present. It being noted that some of the locals were probably seeing men wearing turbans for the very first time. The blast itself was huge. It was heard and felt throughout London and as far away as Cambridgeshire and Norfolk. In fact, at the moment the explosion had happened, the electric lights throughout London failed for a moment. Even the fire engine that had been moved in position to help fight the fire at the Brunner Mond factory was found in pieces a quarter of a mile away. On the other side of the Thames, a gas holder ignited by debris from the explosion also exploded, sending a huge fireball into the sky. 32 local schools were damaged.
And the scale of the blast only really starts to become clear when you look at the numbers. You think, okay, must have been devastating in this immediate area. We've looked at the streets across the road that were affected, and we know the homes that were destroyed there. But when you look at the numbers, 900 homes were destroyed, and on a wider scale, 70,000 buildings were damaged in some way because of this blast.
All of the debris and damage from this catastrophic explosion took almost 2 years to be cleared and repaired.
Now where I'm standing now, this lovely fenced off private garden behind me, I would have been standing right in the middle of the Brunner Mond chemical works. You wouldn't have a clue now, obviously. It couldn't be more different, but this right here would have been the epicenter of this explosion. Well, this is morbidly hilarious. I wonder if anyone in this coffee shop understands the irony of where they placed it.
The day after the accident, the mayor formed the Explosion Emergency Committee, and shelters were opened in schools, churches, and nearby halls to provide accommodation for the 600 people who are now homeless. And the Salvation Army were also there to help provide food and hot drinks. Many people had lost everything, and aid started pouring in from around the country. And obviously, a lot of people hadn't just lost their homes, but they'd lost their workplaces as well. Now, when you think about how dense and populated this area was, it's actually incredible that only 73 people were killed, not forgetting the many hundreds of people who were grievously injured. Many of them lost limbs, hearing, were rendered blind, and among the dead were 19 children, the youngest of which was 4-month-old Ethel Elmer Betts, daughter of fireman George Betts, who was James Joseph Betts' brother. And a gentleman named Keith Lloyd, who lived in West Silvertown for 24 years, shared in a short story the memories of his father, who was 6 at the time.
Suddenly it happened. A huge pink semicircle cloud appeared in the sky, bigger than any of the surrounding buildings. And as I watched, the top of the semicircle opened up to send red, yellow and black smoke belching upwards. I remember thinking the sun must have fallen out of the sky. I turned to run, but there was an enormous explosion, and I felt myself being lifted as if by a giant hand and propelled forward at terrific speed. My ears were full of rushing wind. Then, suddenly as it started, it stopped, and I felt my body drop and hit the roadway very hard. I laid still for a while. Then, lifting my head a little, I could see people being blown about like blackened cardboard. 3 women who had been walking towards where I was lying were suddenly mown down. One leaned against the shutters of the butcher's shop, holding her left elbow in her right hand and looking down at where her hand should have been. The second was sitting on the footpath, and the third was lying in the gutter. I saw a man lifted off his feet by the blast and thrown with tremendous force into a doorway. I remained still for some time, but then I heard something. I turned over and saw a headless woman. Then I thought, that may be my mum. And this was the moment I became panic-stricken. I got up and ran about madly. It seemed I'd been running about for hours, and then I heard someone calling urgently. Jesse, Jesse, here he is. Jessie was being called by my Aunt Gladys, who just could not hide the elation in her voice. He's all right, Jess. Not hurt. And then I saw my mum come towards me carrying my younger brother John, age 2. She said, I've been to the chapel and they told me you'd not been there. I told your father you must still be in your bedroom changing your boots. When my dad went back to the house, he found the bedroom had been devastated.
Those killed were either residents of nearby houses or those working in the TNT factory. Of those working there that evening, 10 men died whilst only 2 escaped. 1 woman also died and another 9 managed to flee the factory. The dead also included PC Edward Greenough, who was the police constable on duty outside the building who helped shepherd as many as he could out of the factory. And 2 of the 7 firemen at Silvertown Fire Station also died. They were Henry Vickers and Frederick Sell. The numbers of dead could have been far greater though had it happened earlier in the day. It being the evening, many people had left work and many children had gone home from school. In the days and weeks after the disaster, several people stated that they owed their life to PC Greenough. The 5 firemen who survived were injured, 2 of them very seriously, and the station officer who survived, when he was discharged from hospital, discovered his wife in the mortuary, along with 3 of his children, and his remaining 2 children were still missing.
I'm now walking down Fort Street, which is where some of the firemen's dwellings were behind the fire station. And there's some interesting pictures of just how blasted out these buildings were. They were behind the old fire station, so they were somewhat protected, but it didn't mean they were okay. As with most of the area, there's nothing left from that era still here.
Afterwards, amongst the obviously many insurance claims, the government paid out about £3 million to those affected, which in today's money is around £40 million. Now, it being the First World War, and as we've seen with many other wartime disasters, there was very little information released to the public about what had happened. Wartime censorship was rampant, and morale was considered very important over revealing the truth. And so few people outside of people in the immediate area were given any information about what had happened. This of course led to rumour and conspiracy, as it would always do, and there were talks of alien agents, German agents sneaking in to sabotage the munitions works. And an inquiry was launched in the immediate aftermath, although not revealed to the public until the 1950s. And that inquiry very easily dismissed the idea of sabotage or of a German spy, and concluded that the most likely cause of the fire was a spark produced by friction or impact, or a spontaneous ignition of the TNT in or about the melt pot. Now, despite the rush for munitions during the war, they couldn't quite do nothing, and so the production of TNT was restricted to less residential districts. But unfortunately, if you know any history of munitions explosions during the First and Second World War, the production and storage of flammable products did continue close to housing, which continued to lead to many tragic explosions during the Second World War, and especially around the docks of East London.
Well, in the little park that I'm about to walk into is the last real reminder of what happened here over 100 years ago. Here next to me is the memorial to the victims not just of this explosion but also of the First and Second World Wars. It didn't used to be here in this nice little park, it used to be closer to the road, but when the site was redeveloped it was moved here, and the names of those who were lost are inscribed around the base of the memorial.
And it's incredibly tragic that in this case, the people this memorial is dedicated to were not just men and women serving their country, but children.
And the regular people who were just living their lives around this factory, and through the haste and necessity of war, were placed into an incredibly dangerous situation, which ultimately cost them their lives. It's hard to accept really that regardless of the reason and the validity of the reason, that nobody should have the place they live become the place that kills them. your home should be a place of safety and comfort. And in January 1917, Silvertown certainly wasn't that. The memorial is very, very tucked away, and it's nice that it's still here, and it is nice that there's an information sign next to it explaining what happened. You hope people in the local area who might be new here and not know about it take the time to stop and have a look. I just think it would be incredible to live here and not know what happened, even if it was over 100 years ago. Well, on that note, from this lovely park in Silvertown, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, remember to like the video, leave a comment underneath if you've got any suggestions for other incidents that I can cover on the channel, and subscribe for more videos like this. And I'll see you in the next one.